Hey guys, what is up? Swim here, and welcome back to a very exciting episode of Meta Mondays. So, last week, of course, we had, the one for the patch. That was actually technically on Tuesday, but we don't talk about that. But basically, this time is going to be interesting because last time we basically were predicting what a lot of the decks and the meta is going to be like, so now we can look back and talk about, where we were right, where we were wrong, and some of the interesting new decks that have cropped up along the way. I recently just got back up to number 9 on the NA ladder, playing my Ezreal deck. This is one of the decks we'll be talking about in this video, but obviously we're gonna cover the whole field, so let's get into it. Alright, so you guys know the drill. We are going to be talking about what decks are good, what decks are, a little bit less good. We're going to be going into the data this week. We have statistics from Mobalytics. I'm going to be showing that off a little bit later. We're going to go into, the actual tier list for now, and then the kind of like data analysis will come afterwards. But I will also put a link to all of the Masters data in the pinned comments for you guys to check out. Alright, so for the time being, we're going to go ahead and pull up the sheet. So as it is, let's check out the tier list right now. So this is kind of my personal tier list as it is. Now some things are subject to change, and as you can see, there's some differences from last week. Most notably, people are mostly playing like the rally form of Fearsome these days. And certain things are bumped up a tier, certain things are bumped down a tier. Let's go one deck at a time. Alright, so Fearsome Rally. Basically, people have kind of decided, for the most part, that Relentless Pursuit ends up doing the most for the Fearsome kind of archetype. The PNZ version is still standing pretty strong, but it's fallen off a bit, and people are basically on this Relentless Pursuit train, which is pretty degenerate. This is my personal version of the list, which tends to be a little bit geared towards slower play. We've got 2 Harrowings in here. I know there's some versions that are running 1, there's some that are running 0. But basically, this one is going to slow the game down a little bit. You're going to be drawing with stuff like Vanguard Redeemer, and of course ending the game with Relentless Pursuit, which in this case is the big reason to be in Demacia. When you've got a Hecarim on the board, they kind of can't kill him because then you'll just res him with a Rekindler, and when they don't, you can shove in with a Relentless Pursuit and basically just seek to close the game out. Effectively, with Deny being nerfed, it's a lot easier to go into stuff like Relentless Pursuit, and even the Harrowing to be able to, seek to close the game. It goes without saying, but this is probably, the single best kind of deck in the game. Like I say, there's a few different builds of it. This is my own personal preference. I like running like the 2 Harrowing and 1 Brightsteel Protector, but there's a lot of different people jamming different styles of this Relentless Pursuit Fearsome deck. As you can see, I've called this deck the Fearsome Rally deck, and it's ultimately just kind of like the deepest form of cancer known to mankind. I mean, you basically are combining the strength of Fearsome decks, as we've seen for the past several weeks now, with the strength of Elusive deck, which, like Elusive Burn, very reliant on Rally to be good, right? Relentless Pursuit is kind of showing itself to be one of the bigger problem childs in the meta, alright? Okay, next up, we have Spooky Karma. Now this is a deck that you'll have seen me play, and I'm going to be making some revisions to this as well. I actually plan on playing this later today. It's tomorrow for me at time of recording, but I guess I should say today. Because I probably will mess around with this concept on stream and see if I can make it any better. But effectively, the idea behind this one is very, very straightforward. You're playing, a lot of these Shadow Isles control cards, and you're using the Ionian package to give you some late game, some value in Deny, which, is a weaker card, but it does remain like an anti-control tool in the meta, and you can still punish out people running stuff like the Harrowing, as well as, the most important tie-in of all, which is Deathmark, right? That's kind of why we're in these 2 colors together. We've got Darkwater Scourge, which obviously is going to be the Deathmark combo, and this plays like a very, very control-y style deck, right? That's kind of the biggest thing here. We're going to seek to stall the game out, control the board as long as possible. Here, let me zoom out a little bit. Yeah, stall the game out, control the board, as long as possible. We have, the super control tools. In this case, a couple Ruination and a couple Harrowing. Now, I'm going to go ahead and take this opportunity to let you guys know, as always, check out the links for the decks in the description, because if I change any of these decks, I'm going to be changing the links, but I can't change the video. So if you want something that's a bit more up to date, make sure you're checking the links. I say that for I gain no benefit from you guys looking at my Mobalytics link. I'm just trying to make sure you guys are getting the most up to date decks that you can. Now I say that here because this is a list in particular that if you're watching this video already might be changed, because like I say, this is one that I'm kind of in the middle of experimenting with and am ready to make a lot of changes to. But basically it's just super control. Harrowing becomes kind of like a win game button for this list, and you're just like stalling out and making sure you don't die early. Okay, next up we've got Kinko Elusives. So Kinko Elusives, this is a deck that I showed during I think it was like the second day of the patch. I showed a few decks that were doing very, very well on ladder, and Kinko Elusive is one of them. Effectively, this is a deck that will play Kinko Wayfinder, you're pulling out Omen Hawk. It's just kind of classic for all your elusives with, you know, some of the kind of like unnecessary cards cut out. We're running the new Jeweled Protector. And this is, by the way, I'm showing Aegis's version of this deck. There's several of them floating around on ladder right now. I actually think, you know, you could add like a Battle Fury in. I haven't messed a ton around with this list yet myself, but I like the idea of like jamming one, maybe two Battle Furies in this. But effectively, the premise is really straightforward, right? It's like Inspiring Mentor gets nerfed, so because you want to abuse Conspirator and buffing elusives, you turn to Omen Hawk, and Omen Hawk can be empowered very well by Kinko Wayfinder, right? Being able to pull them out reliably especially makes Conspirator better. So this elusive deck isn't playing super fast and super aggressive like some of the others. You're definitely like more kind of like mid-rangey. It's not like elusive burn Demacia that's just going to combo you down really, really fast, sometimes on like turn 4 or 5. But this is a very powerful elusive deck as a whole, and when we get into the stats, the Masters stats, you'll notice that this deck actually has one of the highest win rates, but, you know, more on that later. And lastly, the fourth deck that I would put at tier 1 is my Ezreal deck. Now, this is pretty close. This is my version of the list as it is currently, and I will say, by the way, just to let you guys know, these are listed by order of power, roughly. Like, there's a reason Fearsome Rally is at the top of tier 1 and Ezreal's at the bottom. This is actually really, really close between tier 1 and tier 2. I've been very much on the line between that. It has very high representation in, like, top 100 Masters. Like, there's a lot of people running this deck, and it's doing very well. It's difficult to play, and it's either at the bottom of tier 1 or the top of tier 2. It's very close, so we might be tweaking that. But right now, I actually think it does just slide in just under the bottom of tier 1. It's a very, very powerful combo deck. I mean, you guys have seen this before. You know, it's Ezreal combo. You're going to be stalling the game out long. In this current version, I've updated to 2 Progress Day, 1 Rummage, and 2 Get Excited is kind of what I've been liking the most, as well as like 2 Avros and Marksman. The Rummage package with Lonely Poros, ultimately at the end of the day, it's just like too many Rummages more than you need. I do end up liking the idea of fitting in 1 Rummage, but for the most part, it's not going to be super reliable running more than 1 Rummage, because it can just lend itself to really, really clunked out hands. But ultimately, this is a very, very powerful, just super control combo deck. If you guys haven't seen what this deck does, basically, you keep Ezreal in your hand, you know, you stall out the game, maybe play an Elmuck, you level up Ezreal, and then once he's safely leveled up, you can play your Ezreal and play a few mushrooms from Trump Pumps or some cheap spells to just end the game with Ezreal's flipped ability. Really, really common mistake for this deck is people playing Ezreal before he's leveled up, which you will sometimes do, but when in doubt, just wait until he's leveled up to play him. So yeah, this is the fourth, like, you know, pretty high powered deck right now. It's going to do very, very well for you on ladder. And personally, I find it very satisfying to play. It's very much like, kind of like Freeze Mage, sort of like all-in just stall combo deck that you'll see as a classic archetype across a lot of card games. Okay, let's get into like the tier 2 decks now. So for the most part, I will say real quick about like tier 1. Basically, for the most part, our tier 1 picks on like day 2 were pretty accurate. You know, Spooky Karma and Kinko Elusives were hitting pretty hard on day 2. I didn't put that in my Meta Mondays video, but I put both of these decks on my follow-up video the day after, which was actually on Wednesday because my Meta Mondays last week was on Tuesday. Very confusing, but it all had to be like that, I promise. But for the most part, this is all mapped out pretty much how I was expecting. The one difference is that, you know, I had it in my head like Fearsome PNZ was very good, and it does turn out. I do think Fearsome Rally will end up being better. Like the Demacian version of Fearsome is probably just the new way to play Fearsome right now, which I dig. I mean, I'm all over Demacia Fearsome. That's a really, really powerful combo. I was liking, you know, Demacia versions of Fearsome before as well, although I was building them a little bit differently. I'm really, really liking the inclusion of Relentless Pursuit into these decks. All right, let's get into the tier 2 decks and see where we're at with these. So this is Elusive Burn. You guys know this deck. This is, you know, it's Elusive Burn. It's the deck I originally hit like number 5 Masters with. Honestly, it hasn't really changed. Like, we've taken out Inspiring Mentor, and I've taken out 1 Conspirator. I mean, I'm still running 2 Conspirator. It's like, it's literally, before the patch came through, it's like the same deck, except I'm running less Inspiring Mentors, which is to say I'm running 0. But basically, you just rush the opponent down super fast. It's like you play Solitary Monk, then you stand alone. And then it's like you've got a big monk, and then usually you just win the game with Relentless Pursuit, like right there, right? Sometimes you stand alone Zed, that's pretty powerful as well. Got some just general value tools. I've been really liking Bracelet Protector. This is a card that's really impressed me lately. And of course, just, you know, all-in combo cards, right? Like cards like Radiant Strike, maybe get redoubled off of Relentless Pursuit. The same with cards like Repost, right? And cards like Navori Blade Scout. It's basically just like a rush combo version of Elusives. Now, the reason I'm listing this in tier 2 is because I do think it ends up probably being a bit worse than Kinko Elusives. Not that far off, as you can see. I respect this deck quite a bit. I put it on the high end of tier 2 on this sheet. But it's still a very, very powerful list. It's just going to be a little bit less reliable than Kinko Elusives because you're playing for a very early combo. Sometimes you'll just win the game on the spot with like your standalone and Relentless Pursuit, but at other times it's not necessarily going to just be, you know, as reliable, right? Because it plays so fast, sometimes you'll just have like kind of bum draws. All right, then we get to Heimer Karma, which is a list that I was predicting was going to end up being tier 1, and it's fairly powerful, but I would say that for the most part, it sort of loses a bit of its place in the meta. It plays a little bit too slow for how the fast decks are playing right now. Like the super aggressive decks with like Noxus PNZ or even Noxus Shadow Isles tend to be getting under this, and on top of that, it doesn't really like give you enough of a huge win condition against like other control matchups. So this is a very powerful deck, don't get me wrong, it's still near the top of tier 2, but not necessarily as strong in terms of like ladder performance as we immediately predicted. Then we've got Heimer Demacia version as well, which also is just kind of like fallen down a little bit. Heimerdinger is pretty strong, but at the upper ends of ladder, you do see some Heimer representation, but it tends to be a lot more countered. People are, you know, a lot more cognizant of Heimerdinger, playing around him, saving resources to kill him, you know, maybe taking some like strategic passes to not let him come down at ideal times, right? So as much as I like the idea of these Heimerdinger lists, and this one in particular, this one's my own, but they're not necessarily super reliable at the high end of ladder, okay? Then we've got Burn Aggro. In this case, this is not like the full burn version. This is not the version that was running Decimates that you guys might have seen in my earlier video and frankly all over ladder. This is basically a very, very aggressive list. We are still using a lot of burn. So burn in card games basically means spells that are dealing damage. I call Elusive Demacia Elusive Burn just because it's basically turning Relentless Pursuit into a burn card. It's basically 3 mana, deal 7 damage to face or something like that. But in this case, you've got burn in the form of like Legion Grenadier, used Cask Salesman, Get Excited and Mystic Shot are going to be targeting your opponent's Nexus usually. And then of course Jinx with her rocket is going to be burning them down as a finisher, right? So basically, this is a very, very fast aggro deck that's going to be top ending with Jinx. Now, the reason we're using Jinx and not, any of the other discard cards, we're not using Draven, we're not using Rummage, stuff like that, is basically because I find a lot of those cards very powerful, but very unreliable, right? Like when you have stuff like Jury Rig and stuff like this deck is running like one Jury Rig, so that's not a good example, but like Flame Chompers, Draven, like when you draw your pieces together at the right time, it feels amazing, but it can hit some very clunky hands, and that's really not what you want with aggro. So I prefer this version that does run Jinx, but the way we're going to activate Jinx is just by playing a really, really low curve. You'll see here we have 12 1-drops, Rearguard, Saboteur, Pet, and Teemo. 12 1-drops. We're really, really light. We have a ton of 2-drops as well. And of course, we're going to be doing a bit of discarding with Get Excited. So we will be able to level up our Jinx on like turn 5 when we play her. And we're not going to be using discard tools to get that done. A pretty common question is why we're running Teemo in this list. When you do the math on the puff caps, it's a little debatable because, of course, it depends how long you expect the games to be going. But when you do all the numbers, you'll end up with something like 1.8 damage per Teemo attack, which is to say the Nexus Strike is worth about 0.8 damage. So when you compare that to Precious Pet, it's pretty much around the same range, right? He has 1.8 damage instead of 2 attack. And he's got Elusive Tag, which is a bit better than Fearsome. They're pretty close, right? So Teemo, you could say, is about the same level as Precious Pet. You don't really need synergies for Teemo to be a powerful card. And there's actually even, other people running Teemo in similar decks. There's even like a Wayfinder version that runs Teemo instead of Omenhawk. That works okay, right? Like, that's not the worst thing. But basically, this is just like a very fast aggro deck that's going to be taking down decks very quickly. Ultimately, I don't think this list can be tier 1 right now. We are not really in a super aggro meta, period. I don't think that, I don't think that there's any aggro, like pure aggro deck that's going to be effectively being tier 1. Now, Elusive Burn is very fast and Fearsome Rally are very fast. You're going to be killing people very quickly with nut draws, but you still can't really call these aggro decks. They're just like Fearsome is, for example, a very much a mid-range deck that just has like some aggro nut draws, right? Like if you draw very well, you can kill the opponent on like turn 5, but it's still a mid-range deck overall, right? It just has that early game. And then lastly for tier 2, we've got War Mother Control. This was a kind of popular choice early on, but I have downgraded this to tier 2, and there's a couple of reasons for that. I think for the most part, this deck has done very well, but it kind of was a day 1 meta response. I think this was very popular on like day 2, actually, maybe not day 1, but it was like on day 2 where War Mothers was kind of blowing up, and that was mostly just a response to everybody cutting Deny out of the meta like all at once. So you saw a lot of weird things on day 1 and day 2 of the meta, which is going to be a lot of people running like the full burn deck with Decimates. That was super popular. And then of course this deck is very popular, a really good meta response to like everyone running 0 copies of Deny. You're just going to be able to kind of like close the game out here. But now that we've got a more stable meta with like, this control deck, for example, like Spooky Karma will probably do the same thing, but a bit better. You'll win the mirrors pretty hard because you have Deny, makes their War Mother's Call just a really, really, really useless card. So I do think ultimately War Mother's Control is going to stabilize as a tier 2 deck. It's not really like the version of Control you want. And even like Heimer Karma is probably going to be a little bit bigger. At the end of the day, Control really needs to be making sure it wins Control mirrors, right? Deny is pretty important for Control mirrors, but also on top of that, you've got Dark Water Scourge and Deathmark, and with Control you really want to make sure you're staying alive in the early game, and this is just a super, super valuable package when it hits. It's just pretty much a win game button. And I'm not going to actually talk about the tier 3 decks in this video. They haven't really like changed from before. I'm mostly focusing right now on like, the decks I'm going to recommend. But I will say Ash decks in particular, like Frostbite decks, have fallen off in a pretty major way. The reason for that is pretty straightforward. Frostbite Ash is very symbiotic with Deny, because of course Deny, maybe keeps the control decks at bay, and Ash is basically a mid-range deck that beats other mid-range decks, which is why it was feeding off of like the very, very heavy Fearsome meta, because Fearsome's a mid-range deck, and Ash is mid-range that beats other mid-range, right? because you're just kind of like outvaluing them slowly and making sure you're, winning value trades with your frostbites, not dying too early, right? Although this tends to do fine against aggro as well, but now that, Deny is a bit weaker, we hit a bit more of a control-y meta, and suddenly these decks are falling off. Decks like Ezreal will just like counter this. It's actually incredible how hard Ezreal counters this deck. This deck just can't win against Ezreal. It's crazy. This deck has a really hard time winning against stuff like Spooky Karma as well. It's just like very controllable and lacks like big game closers that are going to have like a real impact. Like, of course, you've got Assessor drawing you a bunch of cards, but against the control deck, you're not really going to have that much of a board, right? So there's the real problem here. All right, but that's kind of where the tier list is as a whole now. So just in general, where were we right and where were we wrong? Well, like I'm saying, I was expecting like the Heimerdinger decks to actually stabilize at tier 1. I think they are just a little bit more counterable than I was thinking. And Ezreal is actually a bit weaker than I thought too. Like I said, right now, he's right on the brink of 1 and 2. Just like right on the edge. He could be tier 2 tomorrow. I don't know. Like that's going to be something I need to make a decision about. And I was expecting Ezreal to be like one of the best or the best deck in the game. So I definitely overrated Ezreal a bit too, for sure. And most importantly, the biggest thing I was wrong about was probably kind of like expecting elusives to have a pretty brutal death. As it turns out, to not a ton of people's surprise, a lot of people were like, well, I knew this was going to happen. And yeah, sure, I mean, the signs were there. But to not a ton of people's surprise, it turns out elusive is, doing just fine, right? Fearsome decks are, obviously still meta king, but they do feel less just like completely absurd. Wraithcaller losing Fearsome and the decks losing a lot of like Rosso stuff still does hurt them quite a bit. So even though they're still meta king, it feels less just like, completely absurd. All right, so we can go ahead and get into the stats portion of this video. Now, I've wanted to do this for a while. I know I've been promising in these videos we're going to start getting some stats. Now, we finally have them. These are games from a Masters in the last week since the patch. And this is Mobalytics stats. So anyone using the Mobalytics tracker app is basically getting their games logged and put on this sheet. If you want to see this sheet for yourself, go ahead and click the link that I'm going to pin in the comments to be able to see these stats for yourself and scroll through. Right now, I'm only showing you, the upper slice in terms of games played, but of course, there's a lot more logged here. Okay, so let me break down what you're seeing. So right now we've got, the region, which is of course like the two region letters, like NX is Noxus, PZ is PNZ, of course. Then we've got champions. So what this is doing is listing specific decks. Each row represents a very specific deck that people are playing. So in this case, the most popular Noxus PZ deck is running 0 champions, and this is going to be the Decimate deck, the like very full burn deck we saw in like day 1, day 2 of the patch that I was talking about in my video last week. So then we've got win rate, then we've got pick rate. So pick rate is going to be the amount of people who are playing this deck out of the people that are playing this region combination, right? And then of course games played, right? Which is going to be the sample size, the amount of people running the tracker in Masters. These are just Masters games that are logging this for each individual game, counted by person, right? Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and say, before we get into any of this, the thing about tier lists is that win rate is not going to be the end-all metric. I know that a lot of people will kind of look at a sheet like this and be like, okay, well, if I pick the highest win rate deck, then I'll win more, right? And that's not necessarily how it works. First of all, sample size is really, really relevant, and games played is going to be that sample size, right? That's going to basically determine how reliable win rate is. Like if we scroll down, let's look down here. We've got Demacia Ionia with Zedlucian. Well, this has a very high win rate at 60.7%, but its games played is only 247, as you can't see because my fat head is covering it. Wow, there's no real good place for my camera to be here, huh? But basically, if you want to see that, you can go ahead and look in the fully linked sheet below. Effectively, the idea here is that if you have low games played, your win rate is typically going to be a bit higher. And then finally, the last thing to understand is the fact that a meta is like a living ecosystem, which is to say that with any deck, universally, as pick rate goes up, win rate is going to go down, and vice versa. That's always how it works, period, because that's just what an ecosystem is. The more popular you are, the more vulnerable you are to counters, right? Now, obviously, not every deck will do that to the same degree. That's why different decks are powered at different levels. But for any given deck, if its play rate goes up 20%, on one specific day, its win rate will be going down, especially in the following day or two, because there will be counter decks emerging, right? So at the end of the day, when we're thinking about tier lists, it's not really a measurement of win rate, but as a measurement of the stability between win rate and play rate, right? Because there's always going to be kind of like a place where that stabilizes. So I would just say, I would caution you guys not just to look at a deck and be like, oh, it's the highest win rate, let's play this. Because highest win rate doesn't actually mean it's a tier 1 deck. All right, so let's go ahead and look through the stats. So we're gonna go by some of the bigger things coming through here. We can see Freljord Ionia with Zed, no champions. In this case, that's going to be the Elusives deck. You can see here it's got pretty high play rate at 1,400 games played, and it's got the highest win rate in kind of the opener categories by quite a bit. 61.5% is fairly solid at a good sample size. So yeah, Elusives deck are doing very well right now. It's a good version of Elusives, and that'll take you pretty far. Then we've got Demacia SI, Hacker Elise, 58%. Nothing really new to see there. It's actually kind of surprising how the games played on this is a little bit lower, but it is a newer deck. If you've been following the Masters ladder for the past week, you'll notice that this deck has kind of just blown up in popularity for just the past few days, whereas the rest of these decks have been around for the past week. So, I mean, the games played here is not really represented by current ladder because this is actually a super popular deck right now. And it's definitely pounding some significant ass on the Masters ladder, right? We can check out the Ionia PZ Heimerdinger Karma. There it is as well. Also at a pretty high win rate. This is going to be 58.8 and at just over 1,000 games. That's going to do very well. And then we've got Noxus SI, which is very, very interesting. That's a Aggro Elise list with a pretty standout win rate as well. Although here we're getting into where the games played get pretty low, so it becomes a little bit unreliable in terms of, where it's going to end up being, right? So at the end of the day, you're free to kind of go through this list and see for yourself what the stats are saying. I just want to make sure that we're talking about the lists and where they're going to end up. For example, here, Ezreal is at 54%. Right now, every deck tends to be between 54 and 54%, at least. Some of them end up a bit lower there, but mostly it's 54 through 60% is going to be the range you're looking for here, and you're gonna get some outliers, right? For example, Noxus Shadow Isles Elise, this is a good aggro deck to basically feed off of stuff like Ezreal, right? And that's another good example of the difference between tiers and win rate, which is you can get an anti-meta deck. Anti-meta decks are gonna be tier 2 decks, right? Basically decks that are feeding off of tier 1 decks. And depending on the day, they're going to have higher win rate than the tier 1 decks, depending on the play rates and the win rates, right? So it just comes down to basically, what deck you're talking about and whether it's, a byproduct of another deck existing, right? That's the thing about meta tier lists. It's not to say that tier 1 decks have higher win rates than tier 2 decks necessarily, but they have significantly higher play rates and they bend the meta around them. That's kind of what a tier list is measuring, right? Whereas a tier 2 deck can have a very high win rate, but usually will have a significantly lower play rate. Tier 2 decks are going to be feeding off of tier 1 decks. They're going to be taking a lot of wins from them. and they are dependent on the tier 1 decks to exist in the meta, right? Because it's just a specific counter deck, but not really a meta setter itself. That's kind of what the tiers themselves are measuring. All right, so yeah, that's why like the Noxus Shadow Isles Spider deck is actually pretty good, although I think in my current version of the sheet, I only have it listed as a tier 2 deck, which is going to confuse a few of you guys because I actually recorded half this video without it being shown on the tier list at all. But yeah, Noxus Shadow Isles Spiders is a tier 2 deck, I would say, even though it's got a high win rate here. All right, and that's basically going to be it for this week's Meta Monday, right? That's where we're at right now after the patch, after everything's settled. For the most part, it's the deny change that has changed a lot on the ladder. Everything is shifting a bit more control-y and a bit more slow. You're seeing power cards like Harrowing hit mid-range decks as well. There's going to be a few cards whose power level will probably have to be adjusted now that Deny is nerfed, and Harrowing is probably going to be one of them moving forward, although we'll see. And everyone's still waiting for that Hackram nerf. But there we are. That's it. That's the meta as it stands. Now, what I would recommend to you guys, well, it depends where you're at on ladder and where you want to climb to. As always, if you're just looking to climb without looking for anything else, the things that are going to climb you the fastest are always going to be very aggressive decks that are just going to be able to end games quicker, right? That's what's going to be climbing you fast, pretty much no matter where you are. So I would say a high tier deck that's going to be able to end games very fast is going to be Kinko Elusives, as I showed before, is probably my #1 pick right now. And that's followed by Fearsome Rally is actually probably my #2 pick right now. These are two decks that are going to win games quite fast, and obviously they're both tier 1 decks with very high win rates, so they'll do very well on ladder, and they're very stable. They're very stable against basically a meta response, right? There's not going to be a big shift in 2 days that's going to make this list not good, right? Whereas something like Ezreal, I can't really say that for, because Ezreal is a lot more dependent on, the meta being good for it, rather than, necessarily always fitting in. So Fearsome Rally and Kinko Elusives are going to be my top 2 picks. Those are probably going to take you the farthest, the fastest, and we are, I guess, just going to have to see how things are looking next week. I never know how to end these videos. It's always very awkward. All right, I'll see you guys. I'll see you guys next week. Goodbye.